This content should not be construed as financial or investment advice. I am simply sharing my personal views and perspectives, which I hope will educate and inform and help give you the confidence to make your own financial decisions. If you need financial investment advice, please seek in-person advice from a qualified, experienced, and regulated finance professional. YouTube will not save you. Veritasium. Now, this is a fantastic educational channel, which I'm a subscriber of and I follow. And I wanted to check out this video today about a particular paradox, which apparently splits decision makers 50-50 or near enough 50-50. And I thought it was really interesting, actually, because I think it tells us quite a bit about how we think about probability, how we think about making sort of financial decisions, and how these concepts apply to trading and investment decisions, actually, and why sentiment can impact that decision making, and it makes it very difficult for us to make these kind of decisions extremely objectively and rationally. And I think the other thing it also brings into question, actually, in some ways, is how we view decision making in terms of whether or not we really have free will around what we do generally, or whether things are actually deterministic, actually, in terms of because there's this causal effect and a relationship between what we do and what happens and what it causes others to do, and that can be sort of seen at a molecular level and a chemical level. Is what we're doing possible to predict if we have a true understanding of these sort of mechanisms and these biological mechanisms, and how things and energy interacts with each other, right? And I know that sounds a bit sort of wishy-washy, but I think for me it is an interesting thing to have in the back of your mind when we think about the proposition that Veritasium puts in front of us, and how it would then, how you would make a decision based on the problem that's being presented. So let's dive into this video and let's see what we can learn.
So here's the setup. You walk into a room and there's a supercomputer and two boxes on the table. One box is open and it's got $1,000 in it. There's no trick, you know it's $1,000. The other box is a mystery box. You can't see inside. You also know that this supercomputer is very good at predicting people. It has correctly predicted the choices of thousands of people in the exact problem you're about to face. Now, you don't know what that problem is yet, but you do know that it has been correct almost every time. Now, the supercomputer says you can either take both boxes, that is the mystery box and the $1,000, or you can just take the mystery box. So what's in that mystery box? Well, the supercomputer tells you that before you walked into the room, it made a prediction about your choice. If the supercomputer predicted you would just take the mystery box and you'd leave the $1,000 on the table, well, then it put $1 million into the mystery box. But if the supercomputer predicted that you would take both boxes, then it put nothing in the mystery box. The supercomputer made its prediction before you knew about the problem, and it has already set up the boxes. It's not trying to trick you, it's not trying to deprive you of any money. Its only goal is to make the correct prediction.
And this is a very important point to make, right? This challenge, actually, in my view, is about the predictor, not the picker, right? So, think about the problem and what you would do. But I guess in my mind, essentially, if you believe, and I'm going to use the word believe for now, that the computer can predict this correctly, then that is going to influence your decision, right? And if you don't believe it can do these things correctly, then that's going to influence your decision another way, right? And I'll probably talk about this a bit more as this video continues, right? So it's a question of, what would you do based on the knowledge you've been presented about this computer? And we're just using a computer as the predictor, but really it's a predictor of some kind. What would you do based on what you've been told about this predictor?
So what do? Do you take both boxes, or do you just take the mystery box? Don't worry about how the supercomputer is making its prediction. Instead of a computer, you could think of it as a super intelligent alien, a cunning demon, or even a team of the world's best psychologists.
And he's right in the sense that you don't need to worry in some ways about how this predictor, however you imagine it to be, is doing this. But I think for me, if it was me and this was a real scenario, I would want to understand actually how the predictor is making its predictions. What methodology is it using? Because that would inform my decision making, right? And this comes back to the point I'm making around trading, actually, and how I would go about thinking about a trading decision or an investment decision based on, let's say, a tip, right? You know, somebody sort of puts you on a particular company that's doing well, or a particular crypto token that's sort of looking quite exciting, you know, as well as doing my due diligence, I would want to understand, okay, well, you know, why is it performing the way it's performing, right? What is it that the market understands that I don't understand, essentially? So I think for me, in that context, I would personally want to know as part of my due diligence.
It really doesn't matter who or what is making the prediction. All you need to know is that they are extremely accurate and that they made their prediction before you walked into the room.
And again, I'm going to make a pointed adjustment to what he said there. It has been extremely accurate, right? And this is why I'm saying I would ask the question about how is it doing what it's doing? You know, so if it's extremely accurate, it kind of implies present tense, future tense, right? It's really good at doing its job, right? And you can think about any sort of pension fund you have, or any investment fund you have, or any shares you're doing where they're performing, and you know it's giving you a lot of growth, right? You're seeing a lot of green signals all over the place, right? A lot of green graphics all over the place. You know, how that's going to perform in the future would be unknown, right? We just know at this point in time, if we cash out, we're in profit, right? So that is the way I would sort of interpret these facts as they're being presented.
So I should just take 2 boxes, like obviously.
I'm gonna say I'm just gonna take the $1 million and go with it.
Of course you take 2 boxes.
I would pick both boxes, I think.
I would not get the 2 boxes.
I think I'm taking both boxes.
Let's go. Okay.
This is seeming less paradoxical than I thought, because I should just go in and take the mystery box only.
No. What?
There are 2 camps. 1 boxers who would take only the mystery box, and 2 boxers who take both.
But as American philosopher Robert Nozick wrote, to almost everyone it is perfectly clear and obvious what should be done. The difficulty is that these people seem to divide almost evenly on the problem, with large numbers thinking that the opposite half is just being silly. This is known as Newcomb's paradox, named for its inventor, William Newcomb.
Now, if you find it hard to see why anyone would pick the opposite side, well, here are the arguments for each camp.
Look, I'm a reasonable guy and I like money, so I'm gonna do whatever gets me the most money. So let's go weigh the outcomes of both of these decisions. First, I'm gonna say that the probability that the computer predicted my decision correctly is gonna be C.
You're right, and this is important, right? Because this C, based on past predictive behavior, is almost certain, right? Let's imagine it's like 99%, right? Its accuracy has been 99%, 99.999%, right? So based on past performance and based on how he's presenting this you know, maths problem, because that's how he's going to analyze this, it's almost certain the computer is going to predict what you're going to do correctly, right? So that to me is how I'm taking and viewing this underlying assumption with respect to how he's presenting this mathematical analysis he's going to go into.
And because of that, the probability it got it wrong is going to be 1 minus C. So let's look at what happens if I try the 2 box. There is a C chance of me getting $1,000 and a 1 minus C chance of me getting $1,001,000. If I add these 2 together, I get a weighted sum, which is going to tell me how much I can expect to get if I try the 2 box.
Right, so when you look at that equation, basically what you need to understand is that C is very, very large and 1 minus C is very, very small, right? So the number is probably going to be very, very close to $1,000.
This is also known as expected utility, or the EU of 2 boxing. And I can just simplify this expression a tiny bit. So let's look at what happens if I try to one box now. There's a C chance of me getting $1 million, and there's a 1 minus C chance of me getting nothing.
And again, the same is true here, right? If he one boxes. So in this instance, C is going to be very, very large, but instead of multiplying against $1,000, it's multiplying against $1 million. And then the other side of the equation that he's adding on is going to be very, very small, right? So basically, 2 box gives you essentially 1,000 times C. 1 box gives you 1 million times C, roughly, right? That's the best way. If you're just looking at these numbers and you're a bit lost, that's the best way, I would say, as a proxy, to think about how he's assessing the problem.
We can cancel this out, simplify this to just $1 million times C. If I equate these two expressions, I'm going to get the C at which these two expected utilities are equal. And it turns out that the C at which this happens is 0.5005, or 50.05%, which means if the computer is better at predicting than what is basically random, then the expected utility of one boxing is going to be higher.
So I should go in and take the mystery box and leave the other. Because I'm assuming that its prediction is pretty good. It's a supercomputer.
Okay, so you're saying it's not paradoxical because the choice is obvious. I'm very surprised.
Why?
Because to me, the answer is also obvious. And to me, the answer is you take both boxes. So here's how I think about the problem in a way that actually makes sense. You know that the supercomputer has already set up the boxes. So whatever I decide to do now, it doesn't change whether there's $0 or $1 million in that mystery box.
Now, this point and this perspective is really, really important, right? And that's why I've paused it here. And that's why I was rambling on at the beginning of this video about deterministic ideology around how the world is viewed, right? So when you think about how the previous presenter interpreted the problem, he was using present tense around the computer, and we're just using the computer as a predictor here, his ability to predict. He said it was good at predicting, right? Whilst the framing of this particular presenter's positioning here is that actually there's a disconnect between previous predictions and what is happening right now, right? And therefore, because the computer has already made a prediction, it can't influence what's now going to happen, right? And that's for me the way I would probably be inclined to think about this problem as well, right? You know, just because there's been a high correlation between what the computer has been predicting and what has happened, it can't, as far as we know, predict the future, right? It has no way of influence the future in any way to therefore generate a rigged game of sorts whereby it will be correct most of the time. And that is why I would be doing my due diligence actually about how the computer is forming or projecting a result, right? So that's the important thing to have in your mind around how people may interpret what is going on.
And that gives us 4 possible options that I've written down here. If there is $0 in the mystery box, then I could one box and get $0, or I could two box and get $1,000. But there could also be $1 million in the mystery box. And in that case, I would get $1 million if I one box, or I would get $1 million and $1,000 if I two box.
Yeah, so the key thing, so those are the 4 options that are there. And I think the key thing to think about is to look at the left-hand side of the options and compare it to the right-hand side. So as the previous presenter mentioned, if you one box, the only potential opportunities are you get $0 or you get $1 million, right? But if you look at the 2 box options, right, there's actually an opportunity here to get $1 million and $1,000, which doesn't exist, right? So that is something to consider when you assess it in this particular way, right? Basically, what you're accounting for is a strategy which, you know, includes the possibility or factors in the possibility that the computer will predict incorrectly.
So I'm always better off by picking both boxes. This is known as strategic dominance, where I always pick the dominant strategy.
Yeah, because two boxing will always mean you're better off than where you started off, right? So if you entered into that puzzle with no money, and then you pick 2 boxes, you're guaranteed to leave with some money, right? And there's even an opportunity that you would receive more money than the 1 box option, right? And that's why it's called a dominant strategy or strategic dominance.
So give me those boxes.
The two-boxer argument makes a lot of sense to me. Once you explain it, I'm like, okay, yeah, I can see why exactly you're right. But I can also see that just having those thoughts in your brain are what might allow the computer to give you nothing.
And I think for me, I would wonder actually how many traders would interpret that problem and what they would do, right? Because I think for me, the two-box option to me sort of naturally feels like, you know, what they may do, because you're maximizing upside and you're minimizing downside, right? You're thinking about your risk management strategy, whilst picking one box doesn't do that, right? There's an exposure to basically a situation where you end up with nothing, right? And that exposure does not exist if you do two boxing.
It seems like there are two perfectly reasonable approaches that give two completely different answers. And that's because your choice actually reveals something fundamental about how you make decisions. It comes down to these two statements. First, as far as you know, basically everyone who has taken one box has walked away a millionaire, and everyone who has taken two has walked away poor. Second, the supercomputer made its prediction before you even knew about the problem. The boxes are already set up, so your decision now can't change if the million is in there or not.
And I think for me, it's how you reconcile those two different statements, right? The first statement to me is one of sentiment. It's one of feeling, right? And that is what can cloud judgment. Well, statement number two is more objective, right? You know, in my mind, there is a disconnect between what the computer is predicting and what you are going to do, right? But again, it comes back to the question about, okay, does the computer or the predictor have some fundamental, even molecular understanding of what you're going to do when you walk into that room, right? Can it run some kind of simulation and determine based on certain conditions, you know, certain background checks, your financial condition, right? You know, whether you're optimistic, cynical, right? Does it have a way of building in these variables and creating a condition where it's highly likely that you're going to make the decision it's predicting, right? Can it have some way of taking these into account, right? So for me, that is why it feels in some ways quite philosophical in terms of, okay, how are we interpreting what this supercomputer and this predictor can do? And do we have this deterministic interpretation of the world at large?
Both of these statements are true, but there's a hidden assumption in each that divides people.
We pick both, and the computer picks both.
You just get the $1,000.
I think I would just pick the mystery box.
Just the mystery box, probably.
Yeah.
I might be taking the mystery box.
Just the mystery box?
Yeah, might be.
Okay, why?
I don't know. I guess the supercomputer is right, no?
And I think that's a very natural response, right? I don't know, right? Because I think that's reasonable, right? If you are just sort of thinking about this casually, you know, it's just a fun game. I don't think in some ways it's actually that deep. But yeah, it is being driven by his feeling, actually. And for me, I think that's quite natural and quite normal.
Here's the hidden assumption for us one-boxers. My expected utility calculations are based on probabilities that are using prior evidence of how accurate the supercomputer is, because the thousands of people that it accurately predicted before me is evidence enough for me that when I go for one box, there's going to be $1 million.
So basically, he's describing a bias, right? And I think for me, you know, that's one way of looking at this, right? You know, you've just seen this constant reconfirmation of something. You've seen this really strong correlation of something. So therefore, it's reasonable to hypothesize that the next decision that I make will correlate with whatever this predictor is predicting.
This is based on something called evidential decision theory. And using this decision theory, you get these expected utilities, and my choice is obvious from there. And it turns out a lot of you actually thought the same way. We polled our audience, got more than 24,000 responses, and it turns out 2/3 of you are one boxers.
I would argue the two boxing is more rational, right? I think it, as I mentioned before, in terms of what do I think traders would do, and I don't know what traders would do, right? You would have to ask a trader. But I think for me, the two boxing represents the right balance in my mind of managing risk and managing upside, right? The upside, the maximum upside, doesn't exist under the one box strategy.
That is pretty convincing. Tasker, I'm starting to really doubt this two-box side of things.
How could you not be a two-boxer?
Gregor has this really funny way of thinking about things, but I make my decision based off something else. Something a little more rational, because I believe that whatever I do now can't influence and change the past.
And that's the point, right? So he's saying, whatever I'm doing now, I am repeating him, doesn't impact what has already happened before. But the question would be, does what happened before influence what he is doing now, right? So my challenge to what he's saying here is he looking in the wrong direction? And my actual fundamental question, coming back to my due diligence point, is the computer manipulating circumstances indirectly, or has insight we don't have about the conditions and circumstances in which you're going to pick to enable it to then predict very, very accurately, right? Is it profiling us, is my question, right? So the premise of this game is that none of this is going on, right? So therefore his interpretation in this context makes a lot of sense. But what I'm basically asking, and this is why the question becomes very philosophical, is how we're behaving deterministic? And does the predictor have some way of understanding that mechanism, that deterministic mechanism that basically dictates what we're going to do on any given day?
I only take into account things that I can actually influence. And clearly, whatever I do now, whatever I think now, is not going to change whether that $1 million is going to be in the mystery box or not, because it was already set up before I learned about the problem.
Exactly. So it could be there and it could not be there, right? So I can't remember the analogy about the cat in the box with the uranium or whatever, but that's essentially what you should be thinking of here, right? You're guaranteed the $1,000. We know the computer has been accurate in the past, but it's already made a decision. I don't know what that decision is. So there's only potentially upside, right? That's a very simplistic way of interpreting what he's saying, right? I've got $1,000 guaranteed. Maybe I'm going to get another $1 million, right?
This is known as causal decision theory, where you only take into account things that you can actually cause. And so with this, your expected utility calculation changes. And that's because you need to use a different probability, one where you could actually cause that $1 million to be in the mystery box or not. So right before the supercomputer made its prediction, there was some probability that it thought I was going to one box. I know, it's weird, but bear with me. So let's say that probability is P. Then that's the probability that I'm going to use in my expected utility calculation. And the expected utility to one box is just going to be 0 plus $1 million times P. That's pretty good. But the expected utility for two boxing is going to be $1,000 plus $1 million times P. But that's just the same as the expected utility for one boxing plus an extra $1,000. So no matter what the computer predicted, my expected utility is always higher by picking both boxes.
Yeah, and in some ways you don't even need the maths to understand that, right? Because it's there in front of you, right? If you take two boxes, you're going to get $1,000. And the graph, and that's the reason why the graph is parallel, right? So in some ways, the maths is really helpful because, as I say, when you're thinking about more sophisticated problems, you do need to think about the maths, right? But in some ways, because this problem is so simple, it's actually quite intuitive in some ways that if you pick two boxes, you get $1,000.
So whatever you think is more important, whether that's the evidence of the supercomputer's accuracy or the fact that the boxes are already set up, well, that affects how you calculate the expected utility. And because both of those assumptions are true, both camps have valid answers. But if there's no right answer, then is this just a meaningless problem? Well, not really. Because it actually reveals a surprising amount about three important questions. Does free will exist? What does it mean to be rational? And is there an ideal way to act in life?
And I think this is the point and the crux of this video, actually, right? And this is why I wanted to cover this particular video, right? What is it we can learn about rationality, whatever we consider rational, free will, and how we view free will, and whether or not free will, in a sense, exists or is a simulation, right? So we have a feeling of free will, but actually there's a more deterministic relationship we have, at a chemical level, molecular level, and then by extension, at a behavioral level, which therefore then impacts how we, interact with other people and the environment, right? And again, how we should approach decisions like this going forward, right? How does it inform our future decision making, our future trading decision making, and trading strategies with respect to that third box about how to live life, right? So I think for me, this is why this video is really, really instructive and really, really useful, because it can inform and get us to think critically, actually, around some of these ideas, and challenge ourselves actually around, do we understand what's going on? And can we potentially look at things through a different lens, through a different perspective, and learn and develop on that basis?
For example, the only way you're going to win this game is to already be the kind of person to 1 box, but then 2 box at the last second anyways. That's the only way you're gonna get $1,001,000. If the predictor is so good, let's say it's 100% accurate, then that's not even possible. Would you say that's true?
Yeah.
Then a follow-up question is, if such a perfect predictor would exist, does that mean that free will doesn't exist?
And that would be my question, right? And that is why I've asked the question around, how is the predictor doing the predicting?
Because you're saying there's nothing you can do in between walking into that room and making your decision that ends up changing what was predetermined.
That's right. And maybe this reveals where I'm coming from. And I think where I'm coming from is maybe free will doesn't exist. I come down on this point of like, free will is an illusion, but our world operates in a way that is indistinguishable from free will being real.
Yeah, and I think for me, that's how and I think that's a good point. So when we're saying there's no, deterministic, interpretation of what is going on, it doesn't remove the idea of accountability or responsibility, right? The sense and feeling and illusion or simulation of free will is real, right? We do have agency depending on how you view these things or you don't view these things, right? This is just a philosophical thought, right? Exercise in some ways. It's just something for us to ponder, but I don't think, we're in a world where, we can behave as though there's no such thing as free will. So, just bear that in mind in terms of what I'm saying anyway. I don't want that to be misinterpreted in some way.
If we think that free will is not real and it's an illusion, and then you have someone who's committing crimes, and then you want to say, well, that's not his fault. Therefore, instead of putting, murderers in jail for 25 years, we're just gonna give them some gardening classes or something. Like, the problem is that then changes the environment where everyone knows you can kill someone and you can go to like do the gardening. So you can't change the system based on the knowledge that it's an illusion.
Well, I think for me, I think you can, right? In the sense that if we understand that, yes, there should be accountability with respect to agency, but there is a direct influence potentially, or theoretical influence, on what people do based on their condition, based on their environment, and by extension, their economic condition, their social condition, then I think what we can do, as well as, doing the punishment, I'm not against that, is look at those environmental factors and see how we can use those things and pull those levers to, basically encourage more and more people, motivate more and more people to make the right decisions for society, right? So I think for me, that is why, in some ways, this is a useful discussion to have, even though it feels very wishy-washy and airy-fairy.
Which brings us to our second question. What does it mean to be rational?
And the guy who acted rationally and doesn't believe his thoughts can influence the past.
But your rational choice will have given you $1,000.
I know. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough.
Is it tough to get $1,000? And again, I'm not viewing it in the direction of what we're doing now is influencing the past. My question is, and it comes back to the first proposition around free will, is what is being predicted based on this deterministic mechanism, this deterministic relationship, and does the predictor have a fundamental understanding of how it operates, right? That is what I'm questioning, actually, in my own mind. right?
This is known as the why ain't you rich argument, which boils down to one super annoying question. If you're so smart, then why ain't you rich? If winning is getting more money, then of course the one boxers are going to end up better off than the two boxers. But maybe it's not about who wins, but about what's rational. In their 1978 paper, philosophers Gibbard and Harper argue that the rational choice is to pick both boxes, although they do admit that two boxers will fare worse. They instead say that the game is rigged, and if someone is very good at predicting behavior and rewards predicted irrationality richly, then irrationality will be richly rewarded.
Yeah, and I think for me, statistically, that makes sense, right? So again, there's two lenses where we're looking at the outcomes of this problem. There's the individual lens in which you only get one attempt at the problem, right? But as a population, we're getting many attempts, right? So if you have lots of family members, you get, and you can all pool your money, you can all pool your resources, then it makes sense to one box if that correlation continues to exist, right? But as an individual, the way you manage risk on an individual level and the way you approach this problem at an individual level may be different, right? So this to me is basically an example of where if you're iterating something, so you're doing lots and lots of trades, right? Because you're looking to take advantage of arbitrage, your strategy may be different compared to, let's say, if you're doing a value investment trade or a long-term investment, right? So, and also whether you're going to act as, a group of people or, an organized society or as individuals. So that is the other context I think that you just need to consider here in terms of what is being communicated here in terms of the phrasing and whether or not, again, as individuals, the two boxes are going to be losing out compared to the one boxes. But again, it kind of is what it is in some ways.
But I think that's a bit of a cop-out, because really, Newcomb's paradox reveals something surprising. That sometimes, in order to be a rational person, you must act irrationally.
There's one question of what's a rational person. There's another question of what's a rational act. Most of the time, rational people do rational acts. Sometimes they just don't. And I think this is analogous to the situation in the prisoner's dilemma.
In the prisoner's dilemma, you and another player compete for money by either cooperating or defecting. If you both cooperate, then you get 3 coins each. But if you defect and your opponent cooperates, then you get 5 coins and they get nothing. And if you both defect, you get 1 coin each. So no matter what your opponent does, you are always better off by defecting.
Yeah, and in this example, it's the strategic dominant strategy, which he outlined earlier on. So it's the same thing going on, right? As an individual, and if it's just a one-time thing, then you're always better off defecting.
But if you play this game not once, but repeatedly, then everything changes. All of a sudden, you're better off by cooperating.
Exactly. So it changes if you do it multiple times, and that's analogous to what was being outlined earlier about the fact that the irrational population would be better off than the rational few who two-box, right? Because that's analogous to the population repeating the exercise is analogous to you repeating the exercise. And therefore the strategy and the outcome changes on that basis.
What's a rational society? A rational society is full of cooperators. What's a rational person? Maybe a rational person is a defector.
Exactly. The context of how this is being positioned changes everything. And for me, that's how I interpret it, right? There is no conflict going on, right? It's just the fact that as a society, altruistic behavior, cooperation gives you the greater outcomes overall. But as an individual, if you're competing with those members of society, then it might make more sense under those circumstances to defect.
So while the rational act is the two-box, a rational society would actually be full of one-boxers. Now, I'm a fervent two-boxer, but there are 3 ways that you can get me to one box. The first is if my choices now can actually change the past. For example, say the supercomputer makes its prediction by opening up some tiny wormhole to see the future. Well, in that case, if I choose one box now, that actually causes the $1 million to be placed in there in the past. So I one box. Second, if there are multiple trials, because now with every game, each of my choices builds up a reputation.
Yeah, and I think for me, number two, multiple trials, reputation is the more powerful incentive to cooperate, actually, right? And I think for me, that is a closer analogy of what is going on in the real world, right? Point number one, self-interest, is something we all understand on a basic level, right? But I think the incentives to cooperate have to be stronger in many senses. And I think in broadly speaking, it is actually stronger because the overall gain, the overall opportunity, when you repeat the problem or when many people attempt the problem is much higher than, you know, the number of two boxes that maximize the strategy, right? And I think to me, that's analogous, right, actually, in terms of how we think about wealth distribution as well, right? So I think there's many parallels we can take from this experiment here and this discussion we're having.
So maybe being rational isn't deciding about what to choose in the moment, but it's about deciding what rules you're going to live by.
The question isn't how to act. The question is, what rules ought one to follow, or how does one even decide what rules to follow?
Yeah, and I think when we think about what rules to follow, to me, that the analogy I would use here is what trading or investment strategies or risk management strategies should I be considering based on, you know, what I've learned, you know, through previous attempts and previous successes and losses, right? And I think for me, that is the important thing here, actually. And also just more generally, you know, how I weigh and assess and think about risk and the due diligence that I'm doing as well, actually, and trying to be as objective as possible. And I think for me, that is what's really, as I say, valuable about these kind of lessons we're learning.
If you knew that you were a robot with programming that you could set, and you could rewire yourself to make yourself obey one set of rules rather than another, the question is, what sort of rules would you wire yourself to obey? And what you would do is you would make yourself into the kind of creature that sort of always acts in line with the commitments that would have been good to form had you even known about the problem. When you're in a situation like the Newcomb case, you would end up finding yourself think, if I had been able to make a pre-commitment, what pre-commitment would have been the good one to make? The good pre-commitment to make would have been to be a one-boxer. And since I've already wired myself up to be the kind of person that lives up to all the pre-commitments I would have made, then I'm already, in effect, committed to one-boxing.
Yeah, and if you're wondering why they're talking about this pre-commitment, right, that is the implied strategy when taken as a cooperation between the population at large and the picker, right? It works because if the picker is consistently making the right predictions, you know, let's say 99% of the time, it relies implicitly on the population committing 99% of the time to one box, right? So it is not necessarily a commitment between the individual and the picker. It's a commitment between the picker, the predictor. It's a commitment between the predictor and the population at large. And then the question the population has as a result of all these, you know, millions of dollars it's receiving from the predictor, essentially through this corporation, is what do they do with it, right? And do they think about using it for wider societal benefit? That would be a question they would have to ponder as a society.
If I don't look at it as a single case, and I sort of almost think about it as for every future predictor, for every future case, or like almost building your own reputation, right?
Exactly.
Like you always want to live up to the commitments you've made. So even if you haven't heard of it before, you'd want to stick to those ideal pre-commitments so that you are acting in line with the best version of yourself. Yeah, that would convince me to be a one-boxer.
It's rare to convince anyone to switch on the Newcomb problem.
The thing is, even if I never run into another generous supercomputer again, life doesn't end after I walk out of that room. Like, I should always defect in a one-shot prisoner's dilemma because I can only gain by betraying the other player. But when I play multiple rounds of the game, like in life or in society, everything changes. Suddenly, it pays to cooperate. So being the kind of person that sticks to an ideal pre-commitment is beneficial. So maybe I was just a one-boxer kind of guy all along. All it took was a little reframing and a new perspective.
Yeah, and we're going to leave it there. But as I say, really, really insightful and instructive video from Veritasium there. As I say, really brilliant channel. I can't say enough about this channel, actually. And as I say, I would strongly encourage you to watch the original video, comment, follow, and certainly subscribe if it's something you do enjoy. From my own perspective, as I say, I think what it reveals, and these thought experiments and these puzzles and these propositions, the reason they're so useful actually is because they force us to really think about the kind of people we are, you know, and in this case, what kind of society we would like actually, and more sort of philosophical questions actually around, you know, is there such a thing as free will? How should we think about probability? And how can we apply that to practical challenges and problems we may face? One of them being, you know, how do we make sensible investments and trading decisions? And how do we protect ourselves from the downside and maximize opportunity, right? So that our trading history and our investment history is one that sort of sends us in the right direction, and we can build and grow our, you know, our overall wealth. So I think for me, this is a really instructive video, fantastic video in many ways. As I say, I can't say enough about this channel, but hopefully you found that useful. But until next time, peace.